on to our fourth screencast now, and this one's about unemployment, which is the second of the two indicators of economic performance that we're going to learn about in this unit. The three are GDP, unemployment, and inflation, which we'll see in the next screencast. And taken together, those three measures are basically how we're going to be measuring how the economy is doing. So, unemployment. Now, to understand unemployment and how it's measured and what it's defined as, we have to distinguish between various people in the economy. So I want you to imagine that everyone in the economy, everyone in the country actually, is represented in this little bar graph. And we'll start with the top. This yellow box here says under 16 and/or institutionalized. These are people who we don't expect to be able to work at all, either because they're too young, under 16 years old, or they're in some kind of institution. Now that might mean like a mental hospital, it might mean a prison, it might mean the army. Basically any place where you can't have a regular job, quote unquote, in private sector employment or employment generally, you're in that yellow box. Now the box below that, that orange box called not in the labor force, are people who aren't too young and they're not institutionalized, but these are people who are essentially saying they don't want to work or they're not going to be looking for a job. Now typically those are retired people, but this could also be people who are younger but simply aren't looking for work, either because they don't want to find work or because they think they can't find work. Now the lower two boxes are called employed and unemployed. To be employed, you have to have a job. That's kind of obvious. To be considered unemployed, you have to both not have a job and you also have to be looking for a job. So when we talk about the unemployed in this country, we're only talking about that little sliver of people in that green box down there, the unemployed. The people in the yellow box and the people in the orange box are considered to be not in the labor force at all. So we're going to define the labor force as those people who are employed or unemployed, people who have jobs or people who don't have jobs but are looking for jobs. And the way they distinguish these things are through telephone surveys. Every month they call, I think, 30,000 people and they ask them basically two questions. They say, do you have a job? And if you say yes, you are counted in the employed box. If you say no, they ask you a second question. They say, have you been looking for a job? If you've been looking for a job, then you're considered unemployed. If you say you haven't been looking for a job, it means that you're in either one of two boxes. This orange box, not in the labor force, or the yellow box, under 16 and/or institutionalized. Now I tell you all this to show you exactly how it is they calculate the unemployment rate and to tell you what it means when they say a certain percentage. Because the way they calculate the unemployment rate is by taking the number of unemployed people and dividing it by the number of people in the labor force. If you take that number and multiply it by 100, you get the unemployment rate. So what's important about this is that if you're in one of these two top boxes, you are not considered unemployed. You're simply considered to be too young, institutionalized, or you just don't want to work at all. So when we talk about the labor force, we're really only talking about half the country. These numbers represent proportionally what it really looks like. About half the country isn't even in the market for jobs, isn't even thinking about jobs. So when we say unemployed, we don't just mean people without jobs. If that was the case, about 50% of our country would be unemployed. We simply mean people who want jobs but can't find them. That's what it means to be unemployed. Now, a couple of little distinctions here. Part-time workers. Part-time workers are considered employed, even if they're working only 5 hours a week and they want to be working 40 hours a week. If you have at least some job, you are just considered employed for this calculation. The other distinction are what are called discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people that have dropped out of the labor force because they're so tired of looking for a job and failing. Now this does funny things to the unemployment rate. Let me go back to the bar graph. If I call you up and say, do you have a job, and you say no, and I say, are you looking for a job? And you say yes, then you're unemployed. You're in that little green box. But if I call you up and say, do you have a job? And you say no, and I say, are you looking for your job? And you say, you know what? I'm not even looking anymore. I've tried for like months and I've just given up. Well, you're not in that green box anymore. You would migrate into this orange, not in the labor force box. And so one of the things that happens in the business cycle is that when we go through recessions, when the economy gets really bad, sometimes the unemployment rate actually goes down. Not because we're actually getting more jobs, but because so many people are leaving the labor force because they've given up. And alternatively, when the economy gets better, when jobs start reappearing and GDP starts going up, sometimes the unemployment rate will actually go up. Because what happens is a lot of the people that are sitting on their couches out of the labor force will start to notice that the economy's getting better, and they'll start looking for work again, and as soon as they start looking for work, they jump down into this green box, the unemployed box, which makes the unemployment rate go up. So the unemployment number is a little bit tricky, and you got to take it with a little grain of salt when you hear that number in the news. And actually it was a big subject in the election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. The unemployment rate during that election was going down. And what Obama was saying was, it's because we're getting all these new jobs. And what Mitt Romney was saying is, it's not because we're getting all these new jobs. The reason the unemployment rate is going down is because the economy is so terrible that all these unemployed people are giving up looking for work, and they're turning into not in the labor force people, and that makes it look like the unemployment rate is dropping. Alright, so we've dealt with part-time workers, we've dealt with discouraged workers. Now we're going to talk about different types of unemployment. Favorite topic on the AP exam. People get unemployed for different reasons, some of which are better than others. The best kind of unemployment is called frictional unemployment. And frictional unemployment happens kind of voluntarily. Frictional unemployment refers to the fact that everyone's got friction in their lives. Everyone goes through changes, and as a result of that, they'll be unemployed for various amounts of time. So for example, when you graduate from college and you're looking for your first job, you're considered frictionally unemployed. You're transferring from college into the work world. It's not that tragic, right? Everyone's going to go through that. Or personally, I was a lawyer in New York, and I quit my job there, I moved to Minnesota, and I started looking for a teaching job here. During that period, I was considered frictionally unemployed. It was kind of voluntary. I chose to leave that job. Or let's say you have a really crappy minimum wage job that you decide to quit to look for a better job. That again would be considered frictionally unemployed. You can think of it as basically a kind of voluntary unemployment. And it's a kind of unemployment that economists don't worry about that much, because it's always going to happen, and it's not that bad. The next kind of unemployment is called structural unemployment. Structural unemployment happens when one's skills are no longer needed within the economy. So for example, if you were a bank teller in the 1970s, and then ATM machines came out and you lost your job as a result of that, you're considered structurally unemployed. Now this is a little bit worse because what that means is that these people are gonna have to go back to school or get retrained into, doing something else. So it's kind of a worse kind of unemployment than frictional unemployment. But it's also not a kind of unemployment that we would seek to end in any way. We don't want to ban the invention of ATM machines just so that we can keep bank teller jobs. So think of structural unemployment as unemployment that happens when skills become obsolete, or when you get replaced by technology in various ways. The third kind of unemployment, the kind of unemployment that economists really worry about, is called cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment happens when the economy does badly, when we're in a recession. It's not because people are making those choices, it's not because new technologies are being invented, it's simply because the economy is tanking, and as a result of that, businesses are shedding workers. And that's the kind of unemployment that economists really hate. Because theoretically, if we could manage the economy perfectly, not go through those big ups and downs in the business cycle, and have a nice, steady, smooth growth rate, we could theoretically end that kind of unemployment. Now there's one other kind of unemployment that you may need to know about for the AP exam, although it's not that important, called seasonal unemployment, which is what happens to lawnmowers in the winter or what happens to snowplow drivers in the summer. And again, that's a kind of unemployment we're not really that worried about because summers and winters are always going to kind of happen, and that's kind of unavoidable. Now, a really important concept in economics is the concept of full employment. Full employment means essentially that everyone who wants to be working is working, to the extent possible within a modern industrialized economy. So we're going to define full employment, also sometimes called the natural rate of unemployment, as being equal to structural and frictional unemployment. In other words, it's naturally the case that skills are going to become obsolete, structural unemployment. It's naturally the case that people's lives change, they move, they graduate, they search for new jobs, frictional unemployment. So those are two kinds of unemployment we don't really care about and are always going to exist. We're never going to get rid of those. Now typically that's around 5 to 6%, roughly 5% historically for the United States. At any given time, 5% of people are unemployed for these two reasons, structural or frictional reasons. And again, we don't worry about that so much. So if we have 5% unemployment, what we say to ourselves is that we're doing essentially the best that we possibly can. We're never going to get to 0% unemployment. So we're going to call 5% the full employment rate of unemployment or the natural rate of unemployment. And that 5% number is a number you need to know, as well as that 3 to 4% growth number for GDP. Alright, one last thing for this screencast, Okins Law. Okins Law estimates the cost of unemployment for the economy as a whole. Okins was an economist, and he wanted to find out, well, how damaging is unemployment? What he found, looking at empirical data, is that for every 1% that unemployment is above the natural rate, which you'll remember is around 5%, GDP drops by about 2%. If we don't have people working, they're not making stuff. And if they're not making stuff, GDP is going to go down. So, simple example. Let's assume, as it is the case, that the natural rate of unemployment is 5%. And let's also assume that when we actually measure unemployment using the formula I showed you before, we see that unemployment is at 8%. Well, that difference between 5 and 8% must mean cyclical unemployment, right? Because the natural rate of unemployment includes the structural and the frictional unemployment. So this is 3% above what the unemployment rate is supposed to be, that natural rate. As a result of that, the loss of GDP is going to be twice that. If unemployment is 3% above the natural rate, we could expect GDP to be 6% lower than it otherwise would be. And in an economy where we produce a GDP in the trillions of dollars, 6% is a pretty big figure. Alright, so we've looked at GDP as a measure of the economy. We've also now looked at unemployment as another metric for how we can judge how the economy is doing. In the final and last screencast of this unit, we'll look at inflation, the last of our indicators of economic performance.
So is it any wonder people are afraid of technology?
Technology!
Oh my God.